Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that we hope will help improve your life. I'm Reid, here with my co-host, Dave Burstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
We have a special guest that we will introduce in a couple of minutes, but first, we'd like to just go over a few headlines in the news today. Dave, what do you got?
Well, the price of cartoons just went up in Korea because of Google.
What, come back again with that?
The price of cartoons just went up in Korea because of Google.
Okay, how's that work?
Google imposes a 30% charge on apps, on all the money that goes through the app. And they hadn't been enforcing that against things like TV stations and cartoon special stations. Now they are. And immediately, Naver and Kakao, two huge cartoon outfits and have a lot more stuff, raised their prices to cover the amount they had to pay to Google.
Wow.
The issue on this is worldwide. It is criminal that Apple and Google, who have de facto monopolies on the apps, are trying to take 30% off the top of everything. 5% to build the infrastructure, perfectly sensible. 30%, that's probably the biggest abuse of neutrality I've ever seen. Next, speaking of great things Google did, a former Google tech lead named Patrick Chiu shared, and this is in a tweet, why he believes women shouldn't code. I told them, go have some kids. Don't worry, I'm smarter than you. I know. Now, we know this goes on all the time, not maybe this extreme, almost everywhere. This is different because the guy has now left Google and tweeted about it. Third, we've been talking about the problem of hateful speech. Somebody's doing something about it. Bavaria has just appointed a special prosecutor. They have a strong hate crimes law in Germany, and 106 people have been convicted and paid a fine or went to jail. Last thing, Stu, did you see that New York Times story on image searching?
No, I did not.
Even I was amazed. One of the Times reporters got a hold of one of the visual search engines.
Oh, is that the PimEye story?
Yeah.
Yeah, I did see that. Yes.
And put in pictures of Times reporters with their permission and got back so many pictures, including some they never even known of because they were in a crowd. Far better than I realized they could do it. Very frightening and available to almost anyone.
And the thing that amazed me about that story, Dave, well, one of the things, there's a whole bunch of things that were pretty amazed, but one of the things that they said was they don't use social media to gather their photos. They use news articles, wedding photography, review sites, blogs, and pornography sites. Interesting. Well, anyway, that's a great lead-in, Dave, to our guest today. Our guest is Mathew Guariglia. He's a policy analyst working at the Electronic Frontier Foundation on issues of surveillance and policing at the local, state, and federal level. He received a PhD in history at the University of Connecticut, where his research focused on the intersection of race, immigration, U.S. imperialism, and policing in New York City. Mathew is an affiliated scholar at the University of California, Hastings School of Law, and serves as an editor of Disciplining the City, a series on the history of urban policing and incarceration. Mathew, welcome to Community and Technology.
Hello, it's very good to be here.
Yeah. I was kind of looking over some of your background, some of the stuff that you've recently written about, and we were fascinated by it. Dave and I have talked about a lot of these issues on and off over the last several years. We've had the young man from couple people from Stop on talking about some of the issues that we're going to talk about today. And I just would love to get an update from you in particular, or starting with, I should say, geofence warrants. What's going on with that? And what is reverse keyword warrant? What is that? Talk to us about that, Matthew.
Yeah, so people ask me all the time, what are the technology issues that keep you up at night? What are the ones that most scare you? And I would say one of them is the growing popularity of these geofence warrants and reverse keyword warrants. So what it is when police are investigating something and they suspect an individual has committed a crime or they're investigating them, they have to go to a judge. They have to present evidence, and the evidence can write a warrant. And with that warrant, they can get emails, they could access their mail, what have you. That's how traditional warrants work. Is it's one person with substantial evidence to back up why that person is a suspect. The way these new warrants work is the opposite. So if a crime is committed now, a geofence warrant works like this. If a crime is committed and police are investigating it, they get to draw a little box on a map. And they send a warrant to Google, and they say, we want the identifying information of all of the phones that were inside that box. And so police are, it's a fishing expedition. It's police are not just specifically asking for information on one suspected person. They are doing the opposite. They are starting from the crime and trying to get information on everybody who is around that during the course of the day, which obviously is going to catch a lot of people on the net who are not a suspect, who did not do anything wrong, who are suddenly going to come under elevated police suspicion and surveillance and harassment. So that's what geofence warrant is. It's based on location. A reverse keyword warrant is similar. So where we've seen this happen is, say, for instance, a house catches on fire and they believe it's arson. Police can submit a warrant request, a warrant to Google, to these big tech companies, and they could say, tell me every person who has Googled, Google Maps or MapQuested or Apple Maps that location. So if you happen to search for the address of a friend and that friend is the subject of a crime, suddenly because their address is on your search history, you will show up in the information police will get back from these companies. So once again, it is not personalized. It's not specific people they're getting information on. They are doing the opposite. They are starting wide and they are getting personal information on, maybe dozens of people at a time while they investigate these crimes.
Wow. So now what kind of pushback if any, is there against these methods? They sound really draconian.
They are. They absolutely are. Part of the thing that concerns us is, we saw these being used, these geofence warrants at protests where, somebody started a fire or maybe there was some vandalism, and police can say, okay, Google, give us all of the data, all of the identifying information on the phones that were within 100 feet of where this vandalism happened. And suddenly, police have a record of every phone that attended a protest. I mean, it's a clear violation of people's rights. It's a clear threat to civil liberties. And frankly, not enough is being done to push back against this rising tide of geofence warrants and reverse warrants. A lot of the blame, I think, should be placed on the companies. Companies have huge legal departments. They have a lot of resources. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of power. And yet, when a single sheet of paper comes in from one of these police departments asking for one of these, this information, they don't usually provide a lot of pushback. And these companies really should use the power and their legal resources at their disposal to try to push back a little bit against what is clearly, a really chilling piece of legal trickery these days.
Let me just ask a detail on that, Matthew. When they gather this information, they gather a person's phone number. Do they just get the number, or do they get actual access to the phone's data?
No, I don't even know if they get the number. I think they get some kind of like identifying information. So like, whatever ID number Google has, I think a lot of times it's linked to advertising. It's like your advertising ID number, which, allows companies to serve you specifically ads that relate to your geolocation or what have you. So they don't get your phone number off the top of my head, I don't believe, and they definitely don't get the data from the phone. But that could be a follow-up from the initial request.
So, I mean, are any of the big companies pushing back? Is there any pending legislation? Is anybody speaking up about pushing back on this formally?
Yeah, so I haven't seen a lot of evidence of companies pushing back on it when they get one of these requests in, but New York does have a bill right now on the floor of the State House. It's A84 in the House and S296 in the Senate. And much to our surprise, a bunch of big tech companies did endorse this bill. And what this bill would do is it would block the law enforcement in the state of New York from sending these kind of geofence and reverse warrants to these companies. And you could see why companies like Google and the big collection of companies that make up this this organization that has endorsed this bill, you could see why they would endorse it, because to them, I think it signals a kind of liability. You know, they are really kind of betraying their customers' trusts if they're handing out all this information to law enforcement every time they come knocking. So I think, you know, as a way of protecting their own backs, they are endorsing this bill. And we would really like to see this kind of bill spread to other state houses and even federally.
So right now, New York State is the only state that you're aware of that has pending legislation to kind of quarantine this activity?
Right now, yes. I think New York is leading the way on stopping geofence warrants and reverse warrants.
Wow. Sounds like a very insidious type of data gathering, to say the least.
Yeah, and you know, I hope these companies like, you know, Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo, who are endorsing this bill, continue to do so elsewhere when these bills spring up.
And just for our listeners, tell us again the name of the bill here in New York State, so folks can maybe kind of pay attention to it and track it.
Yeah, it's in the New York State Legislature. It's called the Reverse Location Search Prohibition Act. And the bill numbers are A84 or S296.
Okay, great. Okay, did you look at the that PIM-I story, Matthew? I'm just interested in your take on that. That this is a paid service that finds photos of persons from across the internet, including people that don't want to be exposed. And the story in the Times talked in particular about a woman who some 10 years ago thought she might want to get involved in the pornography industry, bailed out, did not follow through, but some 10 years later, there's still images and pictures of her, pornographic, I believe, that are out there and available across the PIM-I's network. And just footnote, apparently there's some opt-out option that you can do as to pull your particulars away from their network, but that doesn't seem to work either. In this particular case, it didn't. What's your take on it?
I mean, my take is that we are in desperate need of federal consumer privacy laws in this country, because right now it is kind of a free fall for all, and it's allowing companies like PIM-I's to spring up, which really, as you say, pose a great threat to a lot of people in terms of their privacy, especially, you know, adult entertainers, sex workers, people who are, you know, survivors of stalking and domestic violence, who are trying to get away from people. These types of technologies make it much harder to live a kind of safe life away from being found via, you know, pictures of you online, which can be easily cross-referenced by these services. The other thing that really concerns me is that a lot of these services are just paid subscription. So not only could you know, your average person get a subscription and use this, but also police then can easily pay the fee, get the subscription, and that can become part of the larger kind of police surveillance apparatus that doesn't require as much oversight because all they have to do is really just pay a subscription fee.
Wow. Dave, did you want to chime in on this?
Sorry, I was on mute, so I didn't make noise. Who was the assemblyman we had on the show here who was talking about this bill?
I'm trying to think of the guy's name from Stop. You know who I'm talking about, Matthew.
We did a whole show on this. And that's the kind of thing that most people don't bother doing. And we have the freedom here, because it's a nonprofit station, to go to what we think is important.
Mhm.
Stu, I hadn't thought of them geofencing a rally, but they certainly could find everybody who showed up at the Pentagon when we were protesting the Vietnam War. Not anymore, we didn't have our phones with them, but from here on in. And then they can cross-correlate that with every other demonstration happening in the country. And when they find, using facial recognition, well, they may have the names, they probably have facial recognition inputs. They can then turn around and say, these are the 100 most prominent radicals. What should we do about them? Now, in the old days, they had to send somebody undercover. The school we went to, it came out when they investigated the CIA, had a dozen CIA agents on there, because Columbia had been a hotbed of a lot of things. And there were undercover agents throughout the American university system.
Yeah.
It's much easier. Just ask Google.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And with a lot of times with these geofence warrants, it needs to, there's usually some kind of crime that prompts the sending in of a warrant. But at a protest, it could be a small fire being lit. It could be vandalism. It could be an overturned trash can. It's hard to say how little the crime would need to be in order to justify, police to send one of these geofence warrants to Google. And one would hope that if it were, something like a trash can being knocked over, Google wouldn't comply with that. But it seems to me like companies are not pushing back as much as they should be.
Now, if they did it in real time, you could reproduce something that happened to me when I was 16. I got hit over the head and thrown into a paddy wagon, and I wasn't even in the demonstration they were chasing. There was a big demonstration against Hubert Humphrey in the war about 10 blocks away, and the police broke it up, and people were running. And they were running right past where I and a few friends were holding up signs trying to persuade Robert Kennedy to run for president. That had been arranged with somebody in the Kennedy campaign in advance. And they just came by, saw people with signs, and literally hit me over the head and threw me in the paddy wagon. Now, we were politically connected, obviously, when we did that one. And the state assemblyman came down 4 hours later and got us out. But that's the reality. And when you say, oh, maybe they're going to have some fires set in trash cans or something, they don't even need that. As we've discovered, it is very easy for the military or the police to simply say, someone threw a rock. Mm-hmm. And who could ever disprove it? And that's happening every day in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. Stu, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Dave. Matthew, Dave and I are a little bit older than you, and we were, around during the period of mass demonstrations back in the 60s. And to think that, that technology that could be available then, I mean, that's mind-boggling. But you fast forward to today, and you have the whole Black Lives Matters movement and other social movements that are percolating and moving along and advocating for human and basic rights. And this technology is there surveilling them, and who knows where it's going to lead. I just wanted to mention Albert Fox-Khan was a gentleman that's been on the program talking several times over the last couple of years about this issue. He's with the STOP program, surveillance technology. Forgot what the O stands for. But
one of the great political minds right now.
Yeah. He's a sharp guy, very sharp.
Yeah.
But now Dave brought up the issue of the government, not just police, but now of government using this kind of data and material and technology. And I know you've written about it, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the CIA surveillance program?
Yeah, I mean, so recently we found there were declassified some letters from some concerned senators about a program by the CIA, which was potentially collecting, a lot of data on American citizens. What is so concerning about this program is that we actually don't really know anything about it. All we know about it is that these senators wrote letters concerned about how much data it was collecting on American citizens, and that's it. We don't know how it's being collected. We don't know what's being collected. We barely know what kind of the legal justification they're using to collect it is. And this is points to a bigger problem in the government, which is just, when you have these massive collecting apparatuses and you have all these, telecom companies feeding all of this data about the internet, about phones into the government, and it's just sitting in a pool somewhere. And it's and the individual agencies, the NSA, they have to get some kind of approval to dip their hands into that data or to query it, to have specific search terms to go through to look through that data. But other agencies like the FBI have like these kind of back doors that they can use. So once the government has these methods by which to collect all of this data about us and all of this telecom data, how and when agencies get access to it and what they use it for becomes really murky. It's really untransparent. And a lot of times they don't have a lot of great legal justification for why they need that much data on Americans.
Well,
No,
let
go
me
ahead,
tell
Dave.
you one that just came over in my tweet feed. Tim Hortons, the beloved Canadian coffee chain, gathered location data of users of its app constantly, even when the app wasn't in use. Regulators now told the chain to delete that data. It should have been fined $100 million.
And
Apple should never have designed a system that let them do that. Watch you wherever you go, whenever you go.
And this is a great segue to, one of the ways they think the CIA program might be collecting this data on Americans is just by buying. That's, if people listening to this take away, one of the bigger things they should take away from this hour is that all of the apps on your phone, a lot of them, have permission to collect your location. And what they can do with that is they make a cheap buck by selling your location data to these big data brokers, where they collect the data, and usually they sell that information to marketers and to advertisers, so you get ads based on where you are. But the other customers,
bounty hunters,
yeah,
and almost anybody who wants to connect to them, and every private eye.
yeah, and some of these other customers, besides just advertisers and marketers, and bounty hunters, as you say, or investigators, can also be the government. And information they would normally need a warrant for, like your location, they are just getting without a warrant, with nothing else other than a few bucks. And this is a problem. And there's a lot of speculation that this CIA program that you're mentioning, that we know almost nothing about, that the place they might be getting all of this data for that they're collecting on people, including people on American soil, is data that they have purchased from these kind of data brokers.
Mm. Wow.
And before we take a break, let me go to another point directly relevant. Where does the CIA and the NSA get that data? Well, a friend of mine who was senior at Google, this is a few years back, told me that there is an ongoing battle between the near genius programmers at Google and the near genius programs at the NSA, who are constantly trying to break into Google so they don't need subpoenas or anything else to get data when they really want it. And I suspect, knowing how good Google is, if they had to struggle to keep up, Facebook was totally cracked. I'm used to that in telecom. All the phone companies have been cracked a long time ago.
Wow.
Or they've had longstanding partnerships.
Yes, the classic one is Nokia, which bought Alcatel, which bought Lucent. And I was one of two reporters in the world who reported that to allow Alcatel to buy Lucent, they had to sign a contract with the US government agreeing to spin off Lucent on request, because Lucent had a lot of Defense Department contracts. And the world of espionage, as everybody knows since Snowden, but he wasn't the first to say some of these things, is pervasive and very competent and very good at what they do.
Okay, well, with that, we're gonna take a brief break. You're listening to Community and Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reid and special guest Mathew Guariglia with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. This is WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after a brief musical break.
Music a bubble, not looking for trouble. Some shekels the eye shades, just a burn up the last break. Session rocking, yeah.
Okay, we're back. Community and Technology, Stu Reid and Dave Burstein. Special guest, Mathew Guariglia with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He's an expert who's written extensively on surveillance and policing at the local, state, and federal level. Matthew, I see that you've written something called the Essential Kerner Commission Report. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. A few years ago, Jelani Cobb of the New Yorker and Columbia University and I sat down with the Kerner Commission Report, which was this, big congressional investigation from the 1960s, and we edited it down and wrote a new introduction for our times, which was an investigation in the late 1960s into why all of these urban uprisings were happening. What was happening to kind of inflame tensions in cities and really kind of exacerbate the issue of racial inequality in the United States. And they, head by this investigator, it set out to really figure out what was happening in American cities. And what they found was that a whole milieu of issues on racial inequality, economic inequality, lack of proper funding and housing and medical care and urban centers, racism, police violence, all of these things were kind of combining as a catalyst for these big uprisings in the 1960s. And so, in our time of mass protests against racist police violence, against urban inequality, against racial injustice, we kind of edited down this big congressional document and made it a very readable, very teachable document that we can see that we've known the answers to these questions for a long time. It's just finding the political motivation and pushing elected officials to act on these revelations that has been the real problem over the last 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Did you guys find that the findings of the Kerner Commission back in the 60s were still extant today?
Absolutely, because they understood something that we're still trying to get politicians to grapple with, which is, when they talk about what's wrong with policing today, they think, oh, maybe body cams, that will fix everything. They say, oh, maybe hiring more Black police officers, maybe that will fix everything. And they have these like kind of little shallow ideas that they think will fix the problem of policing in America. But what they found in the Kerner Commission was that to address the problem of what's happening in American cities, you need to look at the whole spectrum of injustice. You need to talk about housing and education and economics and healthcare and policing on really kind of like foundational levels in order to address these issues. And the report was kind of buried for just that reason. At the time in the late 1960s, early 1970s, I think a lot of white people and especially politicians were uncomfortable with that solution. That they wanted to just say, people are rioting in cities because who knows why. And they didn't want to have the finger pointed back at them. The society that they created and were perpetuating, were benefiting from, were the cause of this urban upheaval.
Mm-hmm. So is your book, The Essential Kerner Commission, is it kind of reprise the study and maybe make it more accessible, more readable? Are you attempting to kind of raise the awareness and put the issues back on the table, or how are you positioning it?
Yeah, so Dr. Jelani Cobb wrote the introduction, which kind of places the Kerner Commission report in context with our current times, in the era of Black Lives Matter, in the era of Occupy Wall Street, in all of these kind of moments of protest that we've seen in the last decade or so, kind of contextualizing this report then. And then we've taken this, what was like a 900-page, very dry, very long government document, and basically distilled it down to its, essential findings to create a nice little volume that, we wanted teachers to be able to teach it. We wanted people to be able to read it and to understand that we've known for a long time the very succinct causes of some of this unrest. And allow people to look at that now in 2022.
Mm-hmm. Give us the title of the book again and where folks can find it, Mathew.
Yeah, it's The Essential Kerner Commission Report, edited by Jelani Cobb and Mathew Guariglia. And you can find it, in most bookstores. You can definitely find it online.
Great. Now, as you talk about the Kerner Commission report, and Dave and I were around back then, I'm sure he remembers it well as I do. It makes me think about, going back further, and I know you've written and extensively about the history of policing, particularly here in New York City. My understanding, I'm going to hear from you, you're the expert, but, my reading of history tells me that policing began with the policing of slaves, with slave catching and the controlling of Black folks in urban America. Is that accurate? And tell us about the history as you see it.
Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely accurate. People look at the history of policing and they see the early urban police departments in America with their, blue wool uniforms and their badges, and they say, "Oh, that looks just like the London Bobbies. That looks just like, early policing as it emerged in Europe. It must be explicitly only an importation from Europe." And that's partially true, but it is not entirely true. Policing, it has multiple different components. It always has. So if we're looking at the blue uniforms and the badges, yeah, a lot of that was inspired by the early emerging police departments in Europe and in England specifically. But if we look at what those police departments did, which is from the very beginning, they were trying to subordinate and criminalize, free and enslaved people of African descent. They were trying to criminalize and subordinate immigrants who have recently arrived in New York. Then you have to understand that at least a good portion of the history of policing in New York City even also has its roots in slave patrols and in slave catching in the South. And this was especially true when you consider that the New York City Police Department in its earliest form was kind of founded in the 1840s. And by 1850, they had this thing called the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that if a person who was held in slavery in the South had escaped to the North, that the northern cities were under obligation to return them, which means that the New York City police in New York were deputized to do this work of slave catching. And you can look in the historical record and you see that there were people in the South who knew that there were friendly and sympathetic New York City police officers. And you can see that a lot of these Southern slave owners would write to these individual officers and deputize them to go look for their specific property who they think had escaped to New York City. So even if you want to say that the NYPD didn't come from slave catchers, they came from England, one of the very first things the NYPD were tasked with doing was actually slave catching.
I've also read that some of the first jail cells in New York City were basements and taverns and bars that were used to house Black fugitives. Can you speak on that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know much about the early jailing in the city, the early caging, but that is consistent with everything I've seen, because the New York City Police Department started pretty ad hoc. It was pretty not very professionalized or bureaucratized or standardized yet. So it does not surprise me. But and as I've said, a lot of what they were tasked with doing was policing Black people in New York, policing immigrant in New York, kind of trying to uphold those racial and economic divisions of power and the divisions between block to block sometimes. So yeah, absolutely. That sounds consistent with everything I've looked at.
And do you think that history of policing in New York is unique to New York City, or how do you think it evolved in other urban areas of this country? Do you have any insight into that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there is some regional differences. But also what we know is that police in America, even in the 19th century, were very in contact with one another. So you can trace the development of, tactics and procedures and technologies. You can see them as police shared them around the country. So you could see, like the use of fingerprinting. You can see it arrive in St. Louis in 1904, and by the end of the year, it's in dozens of police departments. Or you can see the use of mugshots arrive, and the Rogues Gallery arrive in New York, and you can see it move to Pittsburgh, to Philadelphia, to Baltimore. So, even if there are regional differences in policing, what we know is that police in the 19th century were in contact with each other, and that contact and that sharing of information and tactics and technologies only becomes more and more consistent as the years go on.
Mm-hmm. Did the federal government that you know of play any role in that? I know today, they provide all kind of resources to police departments across the nation. Did they have a role back in the early development of policing in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big ways, and this is going to be part of the focus of my upcoming book. One of the big ways that the federal government played a role in helping to facilitate policing in the early 20th century, especially, was one of the big concerns with police in the early 20th century were immigrants, specifically Chinese immigrants, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, especially, fears of kind of Italian organized crime. This, kept a lot of police commissioners and a lot of detectives up at night. This was one of their biggest concerns. And one of the earliest ways that the federal government steps in to help facilitate policing on the ground is by doing deportations. Is that the New York City Police Department would go and investigate individual immigrant people that they suspected of being criminals, and they would pass that information up to the federal government, who would try to help crime on the ground by removing these people through the federal process of deportation.
Wow. Mm-hmm. And I think that probably continues today to some degree.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there has been a lot of reporting done about the relationship between ICE and the New York City Police Department and the facilitations of deportations. And there, for all the talk of sanctuary cities, there seems to be some police departments in America who never got the memo on that.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about your book. You say you wrote a book on this subject. Tell us about the book and tie it on where we can find it, Mathew.
Yeah, the book will hopefully be out around next summer, summer 2023, and it is a history of the New York City Police Department from its founding that centers the story of race and immigration and looks at retells the story of the history of the New York City Police Department as what was their primary goal, which is racial subordination and criminalization in the city of immigrants and Black people.
Now, when was the New York City Police Department founded?
In 1845.
Wow. So before then, what was there any kind of policing? How did that happen?
Yeah, before then, there was a kind of patchwork group of night watchmen, of constables, of different overlapping jurisdictions. And the founding of the municipal police department, as it was called then, was kind of the first attempt at really creating a citywide, standardized, and professionalized force, where people, this was their job. This was their paying job, full-time. They got a salary. Oftentimes, it was a very good salary. For a lot of people, especially Irish immigrants, it was a sign of upward kind of social mobility, that you could have the badge and you can get a good salary, and you could be in a position of importance, especially political importance.
Mm-hmm. So, Dave, did you want to join in as we start to wind up a little bit? I do want to ask Mathew about other issues that Electronic Frontier Foundation may be addressing right now. Dave? Well, I guess Dave will come in momentarily. Mathew, what else is EFF looking at? What other things do you have on your radar?
We're looking at a lot of things. Thinking about geofence warrants and data brokers is always, a really big issue right now. Where we're investigating more and more the proliferation of surveillance at the U.S.-Mexico border and the impact that's happening on border communities, especially as the administrations are thinking about it as a kind of kindler or gentler alternative to have what they call a digital border wall. And what this is just, really high-powered, really cutting-edge surveillance equipment that is putting, entire regions of this country under a massive amount of surveillance.
You mean Central Park West?
Yeah.
Where around the corner from Jenny's house, suddenly there was a camera from the police department.
Yeah, well, I always say that I think that the two most surveilled areas in America are the U.S.-Mexico border and the interior of most cities, especially Black neighborhoods, where it just seems like cities have an unlimited amount of money to put up all this cutting-edge surveillance technology.
Let me go back to what you said before about how the New York Police Department elevated the Irish. It was all Irish, or not all Irish, but overwhelmingly Irish by my day. And it had for many years been a political situation where you had to have the district leader approve you before you got a job. But I mentioned before that once upon a time, I got hit over the head by a cop and thrown into a paddy wagon. Do you know where the term paddy wagon comes from? You tell me.
I think it's an Irish slur, isn't it?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? Yeah.
Irish. It was a thing for Irish, and in fact, the first 40 years of the New York Police Department, and probably longer than that, the Irish were was a major focus, and that's why they had to have wagons for paddies.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and which is interesting because even if you look at the history of the earliest police departments in London and in England, where did they get that style of policing from and patrol from? It was from English imperialism in Ireland. That the founders, some of the first thinkers, the founders of municipal policing in England, had cut their teeth as governors and as people who were responsible for subordinating Ireland. So even if you want to have the rosiest understanding, the most colorblind understanding of the history of policing in the Atlantic world, you still have to contend with racial subordination and colonialism, because that is what policing was initially founded to do.
And still is, let me add.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow, this has been fascinating. We're kind of running out of time. Dave, you have any final questions for Mathew as we wind up here?
Well, Stu, you were talking about how it hasn't changed that much.
Mm-hmm.
And most people listening know the extreme things around Black Lives Matter and what the police have been doing that became suddenly front page news, although they've been doing it all my life. In fact, in 1967, I worked on the campaign to protect the Civilian Police Review Board, which had been put together by, I guess this is Lindsay's days, and the cops rounded up enough petitions to get it on the ballot, and 2/3 of New Yorkers voted for not reviewing what the police did. A second thing that happened to me once is I happened to be in the subway. I saw a cop pushing his stick into somebody in the turnstile, in his kidney, real strong. And after they had the alleged perpetrator in handcuffs, I walked up and asked the cop for his badge number. I was immediately arrested for resisting arrest, a felony. And they tried to make that one stick. Although fortunately, I found a judge who was sympathetic on that. This is long history.
And I think that's one of the biggest impressions you get, doing as I've done, which is both writing the very long history of the New York City Police Department, and then also working in our contemporary time to think about what policy will govern how police use technology. Is that you get to see that a lot of things really have not changed, and that the longer you live, the more you see the exact same political conversations about how to change policing play out time and time again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we just had the 2-year anniversary of the George Floyd police murder just a week or two ago. So, as one of my uncles used to say, ain't nothing changed but the date. Okay, well, we have been talking with Mathew Guariglia, policy analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's been great to be on.
Okay, hope to have you back. This has been Community and Technology with Stu Reid and Dave Burstein on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Stay tuned every Wednesday, 5 to 6 p.m. Thanks for checking us out. Good night.